Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint the leather boots for Lady Annika. And if you look on the wet palette on the top left there, you can see that there's quite a lot of grey variations of paint. Now I've mixed all these, well, most of these colours myself. So I've already got black, neutral grey and white. So that's black from Vallejo, neutral grey from Vallejo, and the white that I've used is P3 Morrow White. You can use any white you want though, it doesn't matter too much. So all of the other greys on the wet palette there, they're mixed variations that I've done just using those three colours. Now you can use any variations of grey you want. The more variations you have, the easier it is to mix the colours together. You can also use pre-mixed colours if you want. So if you use Vallejo paints, for example, there are an awful lot of grey variations. They have to be slightly more careful if you do that. For example, you've got things like pale grey blue or deep sea grey. Now if you compare those two, the deep sea grey or dark sea grey rather is slightly more yellowy, whereas pale grey blue, or whichever one it is, it's got slightly blue colour in it. So you will end up with slight variations in colour, but that really doesn't matter too much because there's such small differences, because they're all basically grey colours. You just won't be able to tell the difference really when you put them all together, for mixing through the transition layers. If you look at what I'm doing at the moment, you can see I'm just using neutral grey. And now you don't have to use neutral grey for this start, but you can use either, some of the greys either side of it, so it could be a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. It's probably a little bit easier if you have it slightly darker to start with, and then you can build up on top of it. However, one thing I want to say is as well, so what I'm doing is mapping out the highlight placement. But don't worry too much if you over highlight it. I'm going to be dealing with that at the end of the video. And actually, if you over highlight it, you can end up with a better result sometimes than if you get it spot on to start with. The placement of the highlights for this is a little bit tricky. Now you can do what I usually do, and you should do this anyway really, because it will just help you get some of the placements right. And that's just hold it under a lamp and see how the light hits it naturally. Because I want it to be a shiny surface though, the results that you'll see from the lamp won't be accurate in terms of the material that you want, but they will give you the placement, so that's where that is helpful. But because you want like a shiny leather finish, you will have to put in additional highlights, and you will also need to kind of knock back some of the highlights that it shows, because the black primer that's already on there to start with, or black paint, whatever you've used, it's only kind of slightly satin in finish, and that will diffuse the light a bit when the light from your lamp hits it, and that will make the light kind of like the light volumes sort of kind of softer, and they'll spread out a little bit, whereas a shiny surface has much harder light volumes, much harder transitions in the light volumes, so it basically goes from quite light to quite dark very, very quickly. But the rough positions of the highlights will be accurate. Now the problem with Lady Annika in particular for these shiny legs is that the visible area of the shine for the legs is very small. She's a thin model all over. Nearly every detail on her is very thin. And that's a problem for this, because it doesn't give you a lot of space to put in these highlights. So if you wanted to do a big highlight somewhere, that's going to be visible from multiple angles. And because you have to paint this to be shiny from every angle, you're going to end up with kind of highlights that you can see from certain angles that you don't want to be there, and they can sort of mess up the overall look of it. So what I suggest is you pick a primary angle to paint it from, and that'll be basically the forward facing angle. Map out those highlights first, and then for the other highlights just put in smaller highlights that won't be visible from the front, because if you start adding in some of these extra highlights and they are visible from the front, you're going to end up with one. Well, it doesn't matter too much if they're slightly visible in terms of the light placement, because if it's a shiny surface, it's going to reflect random things around it. But the problem is that if you get too many highlights on there, it starts to look grey. Now, I already mentioned that it doesn't matter too much if you make the highlights themselves, the size of the highlights, because it makes it look grey. But if you have too many highlights, it doesn't matter. Then it does matter, because there's so many of them. So we can knock them all back with glazing and things. But there's still too many of them, so there's going to be a lot of grey on there. For it to look shiny black, you need a lot of black on the model, really. So try and keep the highlights as small as you can, but also remember that it has to look good from multiple angles, because ultimately this model is going to be part of a Golden Demon entry, part of a squad entry. So it has to be of a very high quality from every angle. But having said that, you can still focus on like the primary angle, like the forward-facing shot. That's going to be the golden angle. That's what everyone will see. That's what they'll judge it mainly on. But when they're looking for faults and things, they'll rotate the model. Obviously, they'll look at the back and the sides, and if those parts don't look good, then it will get marked down. If you look at the size and shape of the highlights that I've done, they very closely follow the shape of the legs. But if you look at the thigh that I'm doing on now, I'm putting kind of like quite a soft, large highlight. Normally, when I'm painting a leathery surface, and if you've seen the legs that I painted for the Slanesh Chaos Warrior from the Underworlds box, now if you looked at that, the shape of the leg was a little bit easier. It was a bit wider, had some kind of interesting shapes and things on it. It was a lot easier basically to paint that, because it had sort of interesting creases and things, and the extra width allowed you to be a bit more kind of creative in the highlight placement. In this, you've got very few angles you can work with, but the problem is if you just follow that, you just get lots of vertical lines and it looks rubbish, and it kind of mixes in with the dress anyway. That is also something to consider because of the way I painted the dress, and I've used the same colours on I'm talking about the black skirt section right next to it. So I've used the same greys on that as I have on the boot, pretty much. Now, that is kind of a problem in that the boot won't stand out very well, and when you see the finished product on the end of the next video, so I'm doing two videos at once here. This is just a quick video for the boot. The next video is the freehand on the dress. When you'll see them together, so the boot will look separate because of the higher contrast with the very quick jumps between the highlights and the shadows. So it goes very bright, strong highlights in the highest areas, and then it will quickly go into the dark areas. So you can see that with these long vertical lines already. So even though it's just like a mid grey that I've used, it's got the black right next to it, and it's quite a hard line. And then every now and then I'm picking a few areas and pushing the shine up on those. One of the other problems is, to go back a little bit where I mentioned holding the model under a lamp, is because this leg is actually quite hidden, you don't get that much light catching it naturally. So you will most likely have to put extra highlights on there just to pick out some of the details, because you can't really leave it as a black leg because it just looks lazy and unfinished. Whereas even though that's kind of like naturally how it looks. And again, so that's going to go part into a little bit with the excessive highlights. So you're going to be over highlighting parts of it, and then you can knock it back again afterwards with the glazing. And what that'll do is it'll still give the indication that areas are painted and got highlights on, and so it just won't just be flat black again, because you really can't do that on models for competition and things. Leaving areas black and unpainted, even if that's kind of how it naturally would look. Because it'll look great on photos, it just looks like an area that hasn't caught the light. When you hold that under a lamp and someone's looking at it, judging it, they'll be like, "Oh, that just looks like it's not painted." So it's something you have to take into account, that kind of thing. And also, like, even just generally, when you look at a model in your hand, there's always a difference between how a model looks in a photograph and how it looks in your hand. And if you're doing something that's going to be judged based on how it looks in the hand, then you really have to place that above how it looks in the photograph. Just to go back a little bit more about comparing the leg to the skirt. So hopefully you've seen the previous video where I painted the skirt just to get the the grayscale like highlights on there, and then I did the freehand kind of a little bit too lazily, but I did a freehand all over it of like these vine kind of gothic vine effect squiggles, and I didn't like it at the end, so I repainted over it. But before that, I did show you how to paint the grey dress to get to that stage before you put the freehand on it. So hopefully you could watch that part of the video just to get to how it is now already. Although I did paint this slightly differently, I did it a bit quicker because my intention is I'm going to cover this with even more freehand, or rather the freehand that I'm going to put on it will be more kind of solid, like a big chunk. So it'll block out quite a lot of the dress already, so there's not a lot of point to spending hours making it like very textured or anything, because you're just not going to be able to see that on it. But anyway, going back to what I'm actually painting at the moment, so you can see on the thigh there, so I've painted this big soft highlight right in the middle of the thigh, and that kind of matches what the lamp would show, and it is something that's definitely going to be knocked back. But you can see here, so I've got the knee and at the top of the thigh, these are being pushed right up to really high contrast. So that's hopefully going to mitigate some of the grey in the middle, so it doesn't just look too grey. Because having the high contrast at the top and the bottom, you can see right next to those is black, like plain black in the sort of recess kind of areas. So that high contrast is showing how dark those areas go. And that allows me to get a little bit more of the grey in the middle of the thigh. And the reason I want that grey in the middle of the thigh is just to make it a bit more interesting. And so, already mentioned, like if you just leave it as the long vertical lines, you can paint them like that, but it just looks kind of boring and rubbish, really. So, I'm trying to get some interest in there. And really, if you have like a shiny sort of leather effect, or something to say like Catwoman would wear. Now, a lot of the highlights are just going to be sort of white squiggles and things. If you look at how she's painted in like the graphic novels, like basically cover art, the covers for the graphic novels and things, you're going to see that there's not that much grey really used. Like when she has the shiny outfit, it's just pretty much black and white shiny highlights. It's a little bit harder to paint that on a model. So it looks great on on 2D art, but when you see it on a three-dimensional surface, it kind of looks a bit, again, just lazy and unfinished. So you need a little bit more in there, but you still need to get that high contrast look with the the strong white next to the strong dark. But so that little grey section on the thigh, it's just kind of representing a bit of a reflection of shine, because you will get that on a shiny surface, depending on the intensity of the light hitting it. If it's a very bright light, then it's most likely just going to be black and white for the the highlights and shadows. But if you can get like softer light and things like that, bounced reflection lights, you're going to get some greys in there. Generally speaking, they'll still be harder shapes, and by that I mean, so the highlight might not go up to white, it might just go up to a mid-grey tone. But the highlight shape, so it's almost going to be like a mirror finish. So wherever it's black and then it goes into a highlight, there's hardly any transition between the two. It's almost like a very hard edge. And so you can have a go at painting that on the leather effect if you want, but it's very hard to make it look good, especially on something this scale. You just can't get in that many details. And I know this is zoomed in, so it looks like a larger area, but really, like, it's a fraction of a centimetre wide, the area that you're working in. And it might even look good in photos, so you can do it, you can see these marks and things, but you won't, it's not going to stand out really when you just look at it in the flesh. So there's a little bit of a compromise here. And also, I don't want the leg to be fighting with the freehand next to it with it. If I go too crazy with shapes and reflections painted on there, it's almost going to look like freehand. It will be freehand, because if you're painting reflections, you're going to be painting kind of distorted shapes on there. and I'm already going to be painting distorted shapes with the freehand, so I don't really want them to kind of overlap. So I already mentioned as well, so this leg being the same colours is going to kind of blend into the freehand. The freehand is going to be more muted. This is got the high contrast look to it, but when you see it in the photo, hopefully you've seen the photo on my social media, the leg isn't framed at the moment, so I haven't painted the inside of the dress. I haven't painted the back edge very much there. It's just like a dark red at the moment anyway, but I've shown you enough on how to paint the dress that I could move on with the video, so that's just something I'll finish in my own time. But the leg needs to be framed, so I will be painting the inside of the dress like a dark to mid kind of red, and that will then outline the shape of the leg, and that will be quite important. And it might be the case that when I paint that, I will then be able to get some red reflections into the shiny black leather as well, which will also then separate it out even further from the cloth. But for this stage, I'm just showing you how to do kind of the high contrast leather on the legs, and then how to knock it back so it looks smoother and still looks dark while having some reflections in there. You can see here I'm doing the kind of stippling effect. You have to be a bit careful doing a stippling with the leather effect. You have to do your stippling really, really fine, so it looks almost like a smooth transition. Now I know you can see the dots, again it's zoomed in, you can see the dots a little bit. You can't really see them when you look at it in the flesh because they're very watered down. So just keep that in mind for any stippling that you want to do for these very kind of clean looking parts. Make sure it's watered down. If you have it say 50-50 water to paint, something like that, what you'll find is that the dots that you put down will be too strong, and it'll look like a textured surface. Whereas if you water it down more, the dots that you make, they'll look strong for a start, but as it dries they become more translucent, so the water evaporates and the paint beneath it will show through more, and you can build up those dots then, and it will blend together more naturally, so you don't have to worry too much then about it looking too textured. A little bit of texture doesn't matter too much, so if I say like it's a leather surface, you will get kind of imperfections and things like that on the leather anyway, so it's not like it's PVC or something like that. So you can see there I've gone on a little bit further now, and just smoothed in a lot of the highlights and transitions and things, and it's looking fairly reasonable at the moment. You can see here this little highlight that I'm putting in, this is supposed to be like a bounce highlight from the dress. Now the dress isn't even as highlighted as the leg, so really the bounce highlight shouldn't be as bright as the dress anyway, whereas I'm painting it brighter, but I will later on when I do the freehand be painting like an edge highlight down there, so it will kind of work out eventually. But I'm also going to be glazing over it this bit as well in a moment, so that will also knock it back, and that's so just to talk about that a little bit now, when you glaze over, it's not really a major problem to over highlight an area, because when you glaze it back you will actually make it look a lot softer and neater. And so I already mentioned about the textures with the stippling effect. When you glaze over it, it makes it even softer still, and it will just look like a very smooth transition that way. So if you ever find that you're struggling to get a transition going, just remember, just water down the paints and get stippling on there. So what the advantage of stippling is that you have very precise control of where the paint goes. So sometimes you get little patches where the paint hasn't covered very well or something like that. You can very easily, using stippling, fill in those small areas, blend it in very, very smoothly because of the watered down paint, then glaze over it, and it'll fit straight in, and it'll fix any of those issues that you have. So here, just to show you how the difference it makes when you glaze over it. Now, it might be the case that you can't tell the difference too much, but it's more visible in the flesh maybe. But I'm glazing over with Abaddon Black. Abaddon Black, when it dries, gives a slightly satin finish. What happens with satin finishes is that the colour looks darker and richer, and that will mean that actually in the shadowed area part, so like all the deep recesses, everywhere where it's like really dark black, it's going to look even darker black, whereas the dress next to it, which I'm going to be keeping matte, that's going to look more grey. So that will help separate the surfaces out. Now that's something that you're not going to be able to pick up in photos very well, but will definitely show up in, in the hand when the judges are looking at it. But because a lot of people, when they take photos of a model, and I do it quite often as well, is they give the whole model a coat of matte varnish, and that makes it much better for photographing, because if you have a shiny surface on a model, when you take the photo you get reflections from your lights and things, which actually completely messes up the whole light scheme that you have painted on there. It's the light from the lamp and it's not the light that you've painted on, so it looks wrong and it looks bad. So if you give the whole model a coat of matte varnish, it stops that happening. It evens the whole surface out, makes it kind of look neater. But what it does mean is that the colours and depth of the, how dark things go, it doesn't show up quite as well. So, there are always pros and cons to different effects, and, matte varnish just help a lot with photography. So, if you're into social media posting, matte varnish is your friend. But, it is your friend as well for painting models that you hold in your hand, for gaming with and things like that as well. Because it does, like I said, it does even everything out. You don't get horrible shiny surfaces. If you're in a shiny area, it's still going to mess it all up. But if you want something to look glossy, it's very hard to photograph it. Whereas, in reality, it'll look really nice and glossy. But if you look at the glazing that I'm doing now, it's knocking back all the mid-tone greys. So whatever you do, don't glaze over the white areas, because that'll destroy the high contrast look. But anything that's kind of like a mid-tone grey into a shadow area, just glaze it. So you load the paintbrush up. I'm still using a size 00 at this point, but you can use whatever size brush you want. It's just because it's a small area, there's really no benefit to glazing with a bigger brush in this area. Usually when I'm glazing, I use a bigger brush because you can carry on glazing for a bit longer. But you do need the fine tip anyway. And so you load the brush up, you rub it off on some kitchen roll so that it takes away the vast majority of the paint water. When you then apply that, it should leave a very thin coat and dry almost instantly, so you can keep going over areas quickly and not have to wait for everything to dry. If you don't take off the paint on the kitchen towel, you'll flood the area. It'll work like a wash. It's a bit more messy and you don't really want that to happen. But anyway, so that's the end of the video. Like I say, it's a very quick video, but it's just to lead you into the next one, which is the freehand. So hopefully you'll be able to watch that in a moment anyway. That's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.